to this videocast from Australian Community Futures Planning on the State of Australia in 2020. I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of ACFP, and this series covers the facts about the health and well-being of Australia's society, environment, economy and democracy. The issues listed here are among the most important for Australia to solve before 2030. Failure to make substantial progress on these issues in the coming decade will make it harder and far more costly for Australians to arrive safely in 2050 with an acceptable degree of well-being and security. Australian Community Futures Planning is working with Australians to develop a plan to overcome the challenging issues raised in this series. That plan is called Australia Together. This is Australia's first National Community Futures Plan. It is being developed by Australians for Australians and is designed to increase our chances of arriving safely at our preferred future by 2050 or sooner. Factual details and data presented in this series provide the starting points for Australia Together. They pinpoint some of our biggest weaknesses as a nation in 2020. As such, they form the basis for some of the most ambitious targets that Australians can draft into their first National Community Futures Plan. The full set of 7 videocasts on the State of Australia in 2020 covers facts about our nation's health and well-being in 20 critical areas of our society, environment, economy and democracy. This episode comes in 3 interrelated parts. Part 1 covers issue number 9 on the growth of unethical governance in Australia. Part 2 will cover issue 10 on fractious international relations, and part 3 will cover issue 11 on corporate irresponsibility. You can pause this video at any time to consider the points and statistics provided. For the remaining episodes in the State of Australia in 2020, visit the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au. Australia has slipped from its pedestal as a nation without significant corruption. According to our responses to Transparency International's survey of perceptions of corruption, over the last 8 years, more and more Australians have perceived an increase in government and public sector corruption. Worldwide, little, if any, progress is being made towards eliminating government corruption. Only 22 out of 180 countries have made progress since 2012. 137 countries have made no progress at all, and 21 have shown significant declines in their scores on the Corruption Perceptions Index. Sadly, Australia is one of those countries experiencing a significant decline in scores. In our perception, it is going backwards in ethical governance. In fact, out of the 21 countries where scores declined, Australia's declined significantly, and it is now 10 points lower than countries like New Zealand and Denmark. We used to be ranked in the very clean category. We're not anymore. Essentially, Australia is stepping slowly but steadily into structural corruption, giving simply too much power to corporate interest groups such as the Minerals Council of Australia, the Business Council of Australia, multinational corporations in fossil fuels, and one dominating conservative media organisation, Murdoch. The influence of Murdoch is plain, and it has been particularly effective, resulting in massive funding cuts for one of its main competitors, the public's own ABC, the most trusted media network in Australia. Of course, the International Corruption Perceptions Index is about what Australians can see, what they perceive as corruption. It's not about actual proven corruption. But what people can see in plain sight is now quite a lot. Australians can easily see a spectrum of corruption, ranging from relatively small infractions to gross misuse of power and trust. They can easily see federal politicians misusing their allowances and public funds, particularly in travel and accommodation. They can see federal politicians giving out grants for sporting facilities to marginal electorates during elections, against the recommendations of Sports Australia and the Department of Health, against the rules of ministerial authority, and probably against the Constitution. They can see at least one state government, New South Wales, doing it too. They can see we have unenforceable and unethical standards for post-separation employment of politicians, which for instance allow cabinet ministers to court and subsequently take up employment with lobbying firms and other influential corporations. And Australians can easily see interference with public servants in the course of their duty, such as apparent attempts by the Federal Minister Angus Taylor to interfere on a matter relating to his family company's breach of environmental regulations by their destruction of protected native grasslands. They can also see public servants being put upon to administer unlawful schemes for recovery of welfare payments which the government has alleged, but not proved, to have been overpaid. They can see that in the now infamous robo-debt scheme, the federal government has shamelessly removed the rights of welfare recipients to presumption of innocence, that the government has transferred the onus of proof to these vulnerable people and judged them guilty with no proof of its own. They can see the government has admitted unjustly enriching itself in this manner. This sort of corruption, perceived but also real depending on your standards, has become an issue particularly at the federal level of government. 10 to 15 years ago, Australians would have been sceptical about the ethics of politicians from lower levels of government and their vulnerability to corruption from businesses and developers. But due to some reforms such as independent panels on building and development applications and establishment of state-based commissions against corruption, perceptions of corruption in local and state government have abated somewhat. At the federal level, however, it has all got worse. The obviousness of corruption at the federal level has meant that in 2019, 34% of Australians thought corruption increased in the previous 12 months. This is a function of the fact that, in the internet age, more people can easily see corruption on the rise. Still, the obviousness of it and the expectation that they might be more easily found out hasn't acted as a deterrent to corruption. On the contrary, some politicians now seem to not care about being found out. Those politicians who lack ethical intelligence and self-insight and who are therefore unable to question their own conflicts of interests and step away from processes where they might end up acting against the national interest, these politicians have been emboldened not to bother about the obviousness of what more and more Australians are calling unethical conduct, conduct that is against the national interest. They've been emboldened because laws are skewed in such a way as to make that conduct either legal or at least not technically unlawful, and other laws and procedures have been skewed to make it untraceable. This trend of suppressing information about potential corruption was extended at the end of 2020 with the release of draft legislation on a Commonwealth Integrity Commission. This draft was not well received by ethics and governance experts. It contains so many shortcomings as to make it an insult to Australians and an outright flouting of the accountability owed to them by governments. There won't be public hearings. It can only investigate criminal behaviour, not corrupt behaviour, so no investigation could be mounted, for instance, on a politician holding a secret interest in a private company while benefiting from a government decision. It can't act on confidential tip-offs from the community, only on referrals from other agencies. In general, it can only act on referrals from the incumbent elected ministers or those likely to be operating at the top of the allegedly corrupt agencies and political parties. And since it can't begin investigations on its own authority either, it is likely to end up having nothing to do. This commission has been given a budget of $147 million, but it won't have any work to do because it's been set up to be unable to commence investigations unless there is a reasonable suspicion of criminal behaviour, which of course can already be handled within the remit and the budget of the Federal Police. This commission will be like the hospital with no patients, made famous in the 1981 episode of Yes Minister. And if the commission ends up actually trying to start an investigation, the Attorney General has powers to keep relevant information from the commission. The draft bill released for public consultation also introduced draconian penalties for whistleblowers, including the threat of 12 months imprisonment if they refer a complaint to the Commission which is later deemed to be unwarranted and to have arisen from malice. Malicious complaints are of course not acceptable, but prison terms of 12 months will deter genuine whistleblowers with credible complaints, making it far less likely that real corruption will ever be exposed. This legislation may never make it through the parliamentary process, but a government with a culture that can produce this sort of legislation is one that clearly regards itself as unaccountable. Indeed, the potential for unethical conduct has now been so deeply embedded into the structure of our standards, regulations and supervising institutions that some federal politicians now clearly believe that what large numbers of Australians perceive to be unethical or corrupt can nevertheless go on in plain sight, and they will not be held accountable. As one Melbourne academic has observed, the Prime Minister's Department and Attorney General's Office have shown that they are unwilling to aggressively enforce the lobbying code. Since the code was adopted in 2008, there have been no recorded breaches, but this hardly reflects the absence of wrongdoing. Rather, the code is so narrowly worded that breaches are barely possible. And what would happen if a genuine breach was discovered? The answer is probably nothing. No part of the code sets out penalties. In this environment, unethical, conflicted behaviour by any politicians who have now become fully prey to crony capitalism has ballooned into blatant conduct against the national interest. Conduct that makes misuse of public funds for travel and even 100 million in misallocated sports grants look penny ante and small time. Big time unethical behaviour that is legal but still corrupt, goes on now in open view without a skerrick of conscience over the harm to the national interest. Nowhere has this been more obvious than at the 25th Conference of the Parties to the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in Madrid in 2019, when members of Australia's coal mining lobby, people from private corporations who shouldn't be allowed anywhere near the UN climate agreement talks, stalked the negotiation halls hand in hand with Australia's Minister for Energy, Angus Taylor, and derailed international efforts to reach agreement on emissions reduction targets necessary to contain global heating to 2 degrees Celsius. By accounting tricks and collusion, Australia set a wrecking ball going in the COP25 process, which, if it is not corrected, will result in our planet heating by at least 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial revolution averages. Australians have experienced what just 1 degree of heating can do. Devastating bushfires, biodiversity wipeouts, thousands of lost homes, businesses and livelihoods, hundreds of deaths from smoke-related causes, extended droughts, inland rivers drying up, massive fish kills, and the loss of vast tracts of the Great Barrier Reef. And all to drive the nation into an economy based on more expensive, dirty, destructive fossil fuels, heavily subsidised by Australian taxpayers, rather than into a new economy based on cheap, clean, reliable, renewable energy. Little wonder that by the end of 2019, Australia ignominiously scored dead last out of 61 countries on climate change policy in the International Climate Change Performance Index, the CCPI. This is an independent monitoring tool for tracking countries' climate protection performance that has been reporting since 2005. Amid this culture of unaccountability, all of Australians' policy negotiation has been skewed to support an economy based on fossil fuels at the expense of far more productive structures for a modern economy. It has been skewed to drive Australia's economy into industries currently providing no new jobs, and away from industries that will provide vast numbers of jobs. The International Energy Agency, of which Australia is a member, has released research which shows that jobs lost in COVID-19 could be completely replaced and more with investment in energy efficiency in buildings and renewable power. The IEA is quite a conservative organisation, so if it is saying that growth in advanced economies could be boosted by more than 2% in only 2 years just by choosing a sustainable energy recovery plan, then we can assume this is a conservative estimate. This is only one of a whole raft of studies which have been released in 2020 which all say the same thing. In the next decade, there will be more and more jobs in an economy based on renewables and a sustainable natural environment, and less jobs in fossil fuels. With the election of Joe Biden as President of the United States in late 2020, the speed with which jobs in fossil fuels are likely to be phased out is set to accelerate. We are likely to see the collapse of fossil fuel markets and jobs within the 2020 decade. But still, at the end of 2020, at home, Australia's government has appointed a national COVID-19 commission and subcommittees, which is dominated by fossil fuel companies. They're recommending a gas-led and coal-led recovery to the near total exclusion of renewables. Without acknowledging any conflict of interest on his own part, and without demonstrating that a gas-led recovery from COVID-19 has any value for the national interest, the head of Scott Morrison's hand-picked COVID-19 Advisory Commission, NEV Power, acknowledged in 2020 that he had been approached by business leaders wanting the government to use the recovery from the pandemic to lock in low emissions energy, but that he would nevertheless not be recommending a green recovery per se. What followed his acknowledgement that his commission had instead asked the government to underwrite new investment in gas pipelines was, of course, the introduction of new legislation by the Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, forcing the taxpayer-funded Clean Energy Finance Corporation to finance dirty fossil fuels to the tune of $1 billion. It is to be expected that this will be extended with an underwriting agreement whereby taxpayers might be forced to buy gas at a price stipulated by the gas industry, even if they don't want to use gas anymore. We may end up paying for gas that is never actually produced, or worse, gas that is produced and is simply released to the atmosphere because no one wants it. This collusive behaviour between the Australian government and mining executives is so appalling it needs to be called out for what it is: corruption. It is legal, but it is still corruption because it is a grand theft of public resources and the nation's future. And it comes from the inability of those in positions of power to comprehend the meaning of conflict of interest and the devastating impact of a total lack of transparency about potential exercise of corporate interests which run counter to the national interest. This is a completely unnecessary theft of Australia's future. Unless the advice of the National COVID-19 Commission is moderated to ensure it prioritises the national interest, not corporate interest, taxpayers will find that their existing massive subsidies to the private companies of the Commission members and their associates will be expanded with no benefit coming back in terms of jobs, wage rises, a sustainable environment, or a sustainable economy. And if any more evidence is needed as to how much Australians may end up being dudded in terms of future job opportunities due to power arrangements which, on balance, work against the national interest, Australia can scan alternative job plans that have been put together by disinterested groups such as the Climate Council and Beyond Zero Emissions. These sorts of groups are working without help from government to transition Australia into a renewable energy superpower. For more information, viewers can view episode 5 and 6 in this series on the state of Australia in 2020. The government has emphasised its preference for a business-led and specifically a gas-led recovery from COVID-19, and it has rejected a recovery in which government, taxpayers and public investment play a part beyond subsidising private business. Such favouritism should obviously be interrogated, if only to ensure it isn't favouring businesses acting less in Australia's interests than their own. But unfortunately, we have no solid framework in place for this purpose. As at 2020, Australia has no Federal Integrity Commission and little prospect of an effective one. It has hampered powers for Ombudsman and limited powers of intervention by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. It has no assured independence in investigation of allegations of government corruption, no assured transparency about results of investigated complaints about the government, and no acknowledgement of accountability by the government when unethical behaviour is plain. While Australians can see unethical behaviour on the rise at the federal level, they can see nothing in place to check that rise. On the contrary, they can see an erosion of standards in both domestic and international arenas, and a removal of the things that used to keep any tendencies to corruption in check. As at August 2020, they can see both Labor and Liberal MPs, alongside One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts, openly rejecting calls for higher standards of ethics for parliamentarians and arrogantly seeking to reduce the accountability of MPs and senators to their electors. In formally rejecting a Greens Party bill on national integrity and parliamentary standards, without proposing a bill of their own, MPs and senators on the Federal Parliament's Finance and Public Administration Legislation Committee summarily rejected the need in 2019 for a binding code of conduct for federal MPs, something that is standard at lower levels of government in Australia and is in place in other countries, including Canada and the UK. They also rejected proposals to establish an independent Parliamentary Standards Commissioner and even an advisor on ethical issues. In short, they rejected the notion of any scrutiny and accountability at all. This committee rejected consideration of the most basic instruments of ethics in a modern democracy. As though they are above the standards every other Australian would be expected to adhere to in their working lives, they rejected simple, straightforward proposals of the bill for a commitment to uphold democracy. They rejected a requirement to declare and avoid conflicts of interest and refused to accept that parliamentarians should be prohibited from using their position for profit. They rejected a provision allowing politicians to engage in outside employment activities as long as there is no actual or perceived conflict of interest. They rejected introduction of a prohibition on parliamentarians accepting any gift, hospitality or other benefit where there is an actual or perceived conflict of interest. And they rejected provisions requiring the responsible use of influence of the position of a parliamentarian, proper use of public resources, standards for personal conduct, a prohibition on the use of confidential information to further private interests, and a requirement that post-retirement activities not take improper advantage of any office held as a parliamentarian. They would have none of this written into laws that would apply to them. Australians are entitled to ask, what has happened to the culture of our national parliament when the majority can't even bring themselves to pledge the basic tenets of integrity to their electors? They couldn't even bring themselves to support a statement of values for parliamentarians and their staff. No wonder Australians see corruption on the rise. In an effort to respond to obvious concern among Australians about government corruption, the independent federal member for the seat of Indi, Helen Haynes, introduced a new bill for establishment of parliamentary standards in October 2020. This bill provides for statutory codes of conduct for the members of each House of Parliament and their staff, creates a statutory basis for parliamentarians' registers of interests, establishes a parliamentary integrity advisor to provide independent, confidential advice and guidance to parliamentarians and their staff in relation to the applicable codes of conduct, and establishes a Parliamentary Standards Commissioner to assist in the assessment, investigation and resolution of alleged breaches of the applicable codes of conduct. It will be interesting to watch whether this bill is debated or sidelined with excuses from the government that its own consultation on its proposed Commonwealth Integrity Commission bill should take precedence. If that happens, we are likely to see the feather duster Commonwealth Integrity Commission established, but without a code of conduct that it can enforce. For Australians, that's like a pub with no beer. It's a court with no laws. While Australians are being shunted around this ongoing parliamentary circus and getting nowhere, they are being given ample opportunities to observe corruption in plain sight at home and abroad, the quiet and sometimes not so quiet handshakes between government and private interests. Domestically, Australians can see blatant continuation of behaviour by the federal government that is known to be unlawful. They can see things like the government unjustly enriching itself at the expense of the most vulnerable and exposing taxpayers to liability for costs of well over $1 billion for reimbursement of unlawfully obtained monies. The unlawful robo-debt scheme was pursued between 2015 and 2019 so openly, relentlessly and shamelessly that a majority of Australians in 2019 acknowledged a need for a royal commission into this abuse of power. The government carried on insisting on the scheme long after evidence of its unlawfulness was made plain by the courts. It also refused, until forced, to apologise to affected welfare recipients, traumatised public servants and the Australian people for the risk posed to them from insistent unlawful pursuit of unproven debts. The conclusion many Australians are drawing from all this is that the federal government is slipping noticeably in its capacity for ethical judgment. These things are happening in Australia today. Politicians are pursuing vulnerable people for debts they can't prove exist. Having shown little, if any, remorse for proven unlawful behaviour in the robo-debt scandal, we might now expect that they will start doing it again to those made vulnerable in the chaotic administration of relief during COVID-19. The government is also webbing up with big business in the fossil fuel industry to the exclusion of others in the business sector and undermining international agreements they have already signed on to on climate change. They are appointing big business owners to set up the form of our economic recovery from COVID-19. These appointments to the National COVID-19 Commission are being made without open competitive process, so that we may not even be certain they have merit, let alone sufficient independence, to judge how the economic future should be fairly made for all Australians. These unelected people are among the most powerful people in Australia today, and yet there is no requirement for their interest to be declared publicly. Nor, as I said in episode 3, does the federal government properly maintain an accessible public register of conflicts of interest, either for itself or for lobbyists. On top of that, the government has been changing laws, approval processes and rights in justice over the past 20 years to cover up or prevent the disclosure of any unethical behaviour by government in foreign affairs and trade. Considerations of a need to protect governments from embarrassment now override the rights of Australians to justice via a fair and open trial. As I showed in episode 3, this has become apparent in the case of the government versus former intelligence agent Witness K and his legal counsel Bernard Collaery, those two Australians who were at the centre of the disclosure of our country's illegal bugging of the Timor-Leste cabinet meetings in 2004. Those responsible at the time of the bugging were, of course, the then Prime Minister John Howard and his Foreign Affairs Minister Alexander Downer, who later took a job with Woodside Petroleum, a company that benefited from the bugging. The nation's current federal treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, was also heavily involved as a personal staff advisor to both Howard and Downer during the period of the bugging and the unfair deal that resulted from it. But laws which now insist on secret trials in cases of purported national security have ensured that the testimony of those witnesses who are likely to be called as responsible at the time of the bugging can never be disclosed to Australians. We will never know who the real criminals were here. Instead, we have put on trial the whistleblowers who merely made the illegal acts known, even though they did so in compliance with government authorisations at the time. This case marks a significant increase in the steepness and speed of Australia's recent slide into unethical governance. In relation to the Witness K disclosure of the Timor-Leste buggings, the government has stopped at nothing to cover it up and to viciously punish those who told the truth in the public interest. In addition to disabling a public trial in Canberra, they have effectively disabled legal proceedings on the bugging taken against Australia in international courts by confiscating the passports of witnesses set to testify in those proceedings and the briefs of evidence relied on by the plaintiff, briefs which are protected by legal professional privilege and should not be in the possession of the Australian government as defendant in the matter at all. This behaviour, which appears to be theft disguised as confiscation, breaks rules and conventions on which our justice system has always relied. Little wonder that when Australians see all this, they respond in surveys saying that corruption is on the rise. It is plain for everyone to see that our own government's persecution of parties to legal proceedings against Australia is self-serving and heavy-handed to the point of vicious, bearing in mind that in cases where the government has punitively targeted whistleblowers and journalists, it has never, at the same time, even vaguely attempted to deny the truth of what has been disclosed. Nor has it proven that the disclosures were not in the public interest. With time, the high-profile disclosures that have been the subject of punitive actions by the government have all turned out to be warranted in the public interest and true. Changes of law that make it a crime to honestly disclose matters of genuine public interest are steps towards a closed, repressive, authoritarian state, one imposing powerlessness on those who would seek justice on their own behalf and on behalf of all Australians. Because of this and other blatant unethical behaviour in treatment of Australia's most vulnerable and in dismissal of the interests of all Australians in climate change negotiations, it's impossible to conclude that Australia is in a healthy state when it comes to openness and ethics. This conclusion is, of course, based only on what can be seen about the decline in ethical behaviour of our governments. But there is no apparent evidence that would provide a counterbalance to this depressing conclusion. There is no apparent evidence of the government having supported openness, transparency, high standards of ethics, equality before the law, accountability, or independence in investigation of its own potential corruption. On the contrary, since 2014, the federal government has only stalled on the introduction of a workable federal corruption watchdog. In the absence of counterbalancing evidence about commitment to accountability, it can only be concluded that the unethical behaviour we might not be seeing exceeds what we can see. If Australians value an open, ethical society, it would be timely to reverse this trend by a well-planned program to develop an agreed statement of national values and ethics. Only when we have that, and only when we have open sign-on to it by all governments participating in our federation, can we begin to reverse the slide from the position on the pedestal we used to occupy as a very clean country. That sign-on can only be achieved in a new constitution, as I argued in episode 3. The old one is not fit for a 21st century open democracy. That new constitution will need to be developed with the full involvement of Australians and with the final sign-off being given to them in a referendum after genuine full-scale community engagement. It will be some time before we see either party of government in Australia, Liberal or Labor, acknowledge the need for a new constitution or muster the courage for a constitutional convention. But in the meantime, we're in a vulnerable place. The impact of this slide into unethical behaviour in our politics is significant for Australia on the international stage. Australia's federal government is attempting to increase our influence as a middle power in critical negotiations on health, trade, human rights, and of course, climate change. But we have garnered ourselves a reputation for untrustworthiness, something which is detracting significantly from our negotiating power, precisely at the moment when we're seeking to increase our standing as an influential middle power. For as long as we have no articulated sense of what we stand for as long as we fail to articulate our values as a decent 21st century democracy, Australia will be given little, if any, respect as a trustworthy, influential middle power. Our influence will wane. Aggravating that, Australia has adopted a less cooperative and more fractious approach to international relations. This isn't going to work out well, as I will show in the next part of this episode. Australia needs to understand the potential impact of fractious and unethical international relations before we can expect to build a plan to increase our influence as a middle power and to use that power in the nation's best interests. Australians wishing to travel towards a more secure future can increase their chances of arriving there by developing a plan which re-establishes Australia as a truly open democracy and a responsible international negotiator, with all the ethics in governance at home and abroad that entails. Australia Together is being developed by Australians to ensure we can integrate our efforts along multiple lines and travel efficiently to that more secure future. You can become involved in developing Australia Together by visiting the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au. Thanks for watching this episode. For further episodes in this series on the state of Australia, visit ACFP at our website or simply click on the next episode. If you like this episode, please click like on the YouTube page and share it with your friends and subscribe to this channel.